Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and throughout my How Did They Do That series, where I've been answering viewer questions, when I've been talking about Super Nintendo games, I've often referred to as various background modes, but I've never made a dedicated video to explain them all. Over time, I've had a few comments, like these ones from Jago Shogun and Holland Oates, that have expressed they'd like an explanation about this subject. So why not? Let's do it! It's time for a deep dive into each of the Super Nintendo's 8 background modes to see exactly what each of them did, and while we're at it, let's also examine some of the advanced features of the hardware that aren't often talked about. Let's start with Mode 0. Mode 0 is actually the only mode that supports the maximum of 4 background layers, but each tile on a layer is restricted to just 4 colours, or 2 bits per pixel. In Mode 0, tiles can be 8x8 or 16x16 pixels in size. Now, it's pretty common to get confused here straight away and assume this means an entire layer in this mode is limited to using just 4 colours, but that's not the case. There's been a question from a viewer specifically about this actually, as Mr. Taterman asks about the room in the final level of Yoshi's Island, which they have read is using Mode 0, but it's clearly using more than 4 colours on a single layer, so how is that even possible? This is the level in action, and yes, this is using Mode 0, with 4 distinct layers, all scrolling at different rates. As we can see, layers 2, 3 and 4 are actually almost identical, they are just progressively shaded darker to really sell the illusion that they extend far into the background. But obviously, there's way more than 4 colours on each of these layers. The key here is that the 4 colour restriction is per tile, but the total number of available colours for a whole layer is more than that. In reality, each layer actually has access to 2 full colour palettes, and they are each assigned their own palettes, so you can change the colours for one layer without worrying about whether it'll affect the others. Layer 1 gets palettes 0 and 1, Layer 2 gets palettes 2 and 3, Layer 3 gets palettes 4 and 5, and Layer 4 gets palettes 6 and 7. But it's more restrictive than that, because each palette is divided up into 4 smaller palettes of 4 colours each, and only one palette of 4 colours can be assigned to a given tile on that layer. But there's nothing stopping another palette of 4 colours being assigned to a different tile on that same layer. Well, I say a palette of 4 colours, but technically it's actually a palette of 3 colours, because the first colour in each smaller palette is assigned to be transparent, except for palette index 00, which is the backdrop colour. This means, at least in theory, that each layer in Mode 0 has access to up to 24 colours, once you subtract the transparent colour in each smaller palette, giving it a possible maximum of 96 background colours plus the backdrop colour on screen at once. You need to keep in mind though, that you actually need to draw coherent and consistent shapes on the screen, and you can't do that if you're using a different palette for every tile, so the mode is still quite limited in this regard. Usage of Mode 0 was generally pretty rare, but we've seen a few examples during this series of Mode 0 being used, like the Death Star Trench Run in Super Star Wars, or Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden 2, or these VR levels in The Lawnmower Man. You can see the colour limitation is more apparent in these examples. But Yoshi's Island shows what could be done with it with the right art direction, and another game that makes good use of the available colours in this mode is The Simpsons: Bart's Nightmare, and the limitations actually work really well for this game to help it match the aesthetic of the show. Some games, like Tales of Fantasia, also use it to add extra layers to menu screens that typically don't need many colours. Super Mario Kart's character select screen is also in Mode 0. Speaking of Super Mario Kart, it also uses it during gameplay in combination with Mode 7 that it's more well known for, by changing background modes mid-frame. The Skyline portion of the screen uses Mode 0. There's also some other games that use this approach too, such as MechWarrior. In this case, Mode 0 is actually taking up the majority of the screen space. It's the whole top portion and also the bottom portion. Mode 7 is just a small segment in between. Neither Super Mario Kart nor MechWarrior really take advantage of the extra layers Mode 0 provides, however. Mode 1 was by far the most commonly used mode. It provided 3 background layers, 2 layers at 4 bits per pixel, and 1 layer at 2 bits per pixel. Each tile in layer 1 and layer 2 could use all 16 colours from a palette and had access to a total of 128 colours, or 121 colours once you subtract the transparent ones. The tiles in layer 3, like mode 0, are restricted to 3 colours each out of a total of 24. In mode 1, tiles can be 8 by 8 or 16 by 16 in size. Unlike mode 0, however, there's some overlap in the palettes that each background layer has access to, so backgrounds usually needed to share colours. Layer 1 and 2 had access to the entire 128 colours available for backgrounds, while layer 3 specifically had to use the first 32 colours. This usually wasn't too much of an issue, but developers did need to be careful to not accidentally affect colours in other layers when making changes. Some worked around this problem by artificially restricting layer 1 to using the first 8 colours in the palettes and layer 2 to using the last 8 colours. It was often the case that given the lack of colours, the third layer contained a status bar or HUD, and mode 1 specifically had a special register that facilitated it being used for that purpose. As I outlined a couple of videos ago when talking about the priority system in relation to Secret of Mana, normally in mode 1, the priority order looks like this. Sprite level 3 is at the very front, then layer 1 high, layer 2 high, sprite level 2, layer 1 low, layer 2 low, sprite level 1, layer 3 high, sprite level 0, and finally layer 3 low at the very back. But there was an extra optional priority bit on mode 1, and only mode 1, that moved the high priority tiles on layer 3 from near the back to the very front, even in front of the highest priority sprites. The exact intention of this was to make sure that these important static screen elements were always visible. If you close your eyes and point to practically any given game on the Super Nintendo, chances are it runs in mode 1 at some point, if not for the majority of the game. Some examples are Super Metroid, Street Fighter II Turbo, Mega Man X, Secret of Mana, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Smash TV, but there's literally hundreds of them. It was easily the most popular mode, as it provided the right balance of layers and colours that most developers wanted. Mode 2 was almost identical to Mode 1, except it sacrifices the third layer to include offset per tile. Its 2 available background layers are both 4 bits per pixel, giving them 16 colours from a total of 128, or 15 from 121 once you factor in transparent colours. In Mode 2, tiles can be 8 by 8 or 16 by 16 in size. Offset per tile is the main feature of this mode, which enables individual columns of tiles to be scrolled vertically or horizontally. So it's officially called offset per tile, but it affects entire columns rather than just one tile at a time, so it's probably more accurate to call it offset per column. Vertical offset per tile is extremely precise, allowing columns to be scrolled up or down with control down to the pixel. Clever usage of this can create the effect of background tilts without the use of Mode 7, by moving the columns one side of the tile map down while pushing the ones on the other side up. I've covered this in the past in my video about games commonly mistaken for using Mode 7, as this is exactly how Star Fox, or Star Wing as I knew it, achieved its tilting backgrounds. That's not Mode 7, it's not a full rotation, that's Mode 2 using offset per tile to create a tilt. Another good example is the title screen in Chrono Trigger, which I've also previously covered in my video dedicated to that game. Offset per tile in Mode 2 is how the wavy animation is done. A similar looking effect is found in Battletoads and Battle Maniacs that appears before you select your character. In this case, it's combining vertical offset per tile with individual line scrolling to achieve the final result. Nathan Daniels 4823 actually left a comment on a previous video asking how the logs on the bridge stage seem to bounce under your weight in Killer Instinct. This is how. Killer Instinct has a pretty neat use of Mode 2 in this stage with a suspended bridge over a desert canyon. Offset per tile is used to make the segments of the bridge move up and down as the characters walk and jump on it. Super Turrican 2 uses a very similar implementation in this level. It's using Mode 1 in the top portion, then there's a screen split to swap to Mode 2 in the bottom portion, which is used to make the segments of these snakes individually move up and down. It uses it again later in the game in this level, where you need to jump across these rockets that are shooting upwards. The rockets are all on a single background layer and are being individually moved up at different speeds using vertical offsets. Axlay has a pretty nice use of offset per tile in the second level. The game switches into mode 2 to move these environmental obstacles up and down, so it's not just a visual effect here, it actually makes a difference to gameplay. Often when we see this type of thing, these moving objects are sprites, but in this case they are part of the background and are being moved with vertical offsets. Panel Depon and its international Yoshi themed reskin Tetris Attack use vertical offsets in mode 2 to continuously push the player fields upwards. Another one we've previously studied is the first boss in Contra 3, Slave Beast Taka, whose warping body is done with vertical offset per tile as well. But I'll bring this guy up for another reason, as he's also an example of horizontal offset per tile being used. This was far less common because the scrolling was a lot more coarse. It could only horizontally scroll a column by 8 pixels or 1 tile's width at a time. This is how he's extending and retracting his neck. The animation is really fast, which covers up the fact that it's moving 1 tile at a time. Aside from a few specific use cases like this though, developers generally prefer to just use regular horizontal background tile map scrolling. Mode 3 also has 2 background layers, but the first layer is 8 bits per pixel, allowing each tile to use the full 256 colours in CG RAM. However, it doesn't necessarily need to do this because this is one of the modes that supports direct colour. Layer 2 is 4 bits per pixel, like Mode 1 and Mode 2 use, allowing 16 colours from 128, or 15 colours from 121 when accounting for the transparent ones. In Mode 3, tiles can be 8x8 or 16x16 in size. To expand a bit on direct colour, in a nutshell, instead of needing to reference a palette and index of colours that are loaded into CG RAM, commonly called indirect colour, it specifies colours directly with RGB values, bypassing the palettes entirely and allowing it access to colours that aren't even loaded into CG RAM. In Mode 3, direct colour only applies to background layer 1, while layer 2 and the sprite layer still use the indexed colours as normal. With direct colour in Mode 3, layer 1 alone can actually use 256 colours in a single tile, and can theoretically display up to 2048 colours on screen at once, or 255 per tile and 2041 on screen after subtracting the transparent colours, although there are some caveats around this, and in practice it's more limited. This is because even though it sounds like you could access any of the 32,768 colours the hardware was capable of, which would have been amazing, that's not the case. In reality, you had to choose a colour from one of 8 preset palettes of 256 colours that are stored in VRAM that are just tinted with slightly more red, green or blue or some combination of them. You might not even notice any difference between them at all unless you look really closely. Pure black or pure white also can't be achieved. And because blue is specified with only 2 bits instead of 3 like red and green, not all blues are available either. So while technically direct colour is capable of 2048 colours, it's not really a 2048 colour mode. More like an 8 slight variations of 256 colour mode. For this reason, even though direct colour was available in modes 3, 4 and 7, usage of it was very uncommon. Developers mostly opted to just use indirect colour with index palettes, and took advantage of Mode 3's capability to access all 256 colours within that, even the ones in the bottom half normally reserved for sprites. Secret of Mana is one example that uses Mode 3 and direct colour to draw the flat world map you can access while riding Flammy. Another game that uses direct colour in Mode 3 is Rocko's Modern Life, Spunky's Dangerous Day, during these cutscenes that play between levels. Generally speaking, Mode 3 wasn't used for gameplay too often, and instead was mostly used for static screens to display high quality images that needed lots of colour, like the ones we see here in Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures. They really do look quite impressive for the hardware. It was often used in title screens, like these ones in Animaniacs and Aero the Acrobat. Earthbound's opening screen animation is done entirely in Mode 3. Nosferatu uses it in many of its cutscenes, such as this one. These cutscenes in Super Turrican 2 are also all running in Mode 3. Super Mario All-Stars also uses Mode 3 for the game select screen. Killer Instinct uses it for the matchup screen before a fight, and Uni Rally, also known as Uni Races, runs in Mode 3 for most of its menus. However, a handful of games did use it during gameplay. SimCity 2000 is a pretty good example, and you can really notice the extra colours being put to good use here. It uses the 8 BPP layer for the city and the 4 BPP layer for the graphical user interface. Zoop is another example of using Mode 3 for gameplay, though the second layer here isn't used at all. NBA All-Star Challenge also uses it during gameplay to display the basketball court in high detail. In fact, this game uses it a lot because it's also used for many of the game's menu screens as well, to display the photos in the background with a pretty high degree of clarity. Interestingly, a number of Super FX games also run in Mode 3. Stunt Race FX and Dirt Tracks FX both do, though the advantage of the extra colours doesn't really seem too apparent if you compare them side by side with Star Fox that mostly runs in Mode 2. I think the most interesting one though is Doom. Yeah, this is running in Mode 3. Since the only sprites in the game are the player's gun and the stuff in the HUD, which don't use many colours, they take advantage of Mode 3 to use the sprite palettes in addition to the background palettes to render everything else, from the environments to the enemies to the pickups with the Super FX2 chip. Mode 4 is very similar to Mode 3, with Layer 1 being 8 bits per pixel and supporting direct colour. The difference is, Layer 2 is limited to 2 bits per pixel instead of 4, restricting it to using 3 colours per tile from a total of 24 like Mode 0. This restriction in Layer 2 is in place in order to support offset per tile. In Mode 4, tiles can be 8x8 or 16x16 in size. Usage of Mode 4 in general was extremely rare. While it's not a very good game, Timecop has an intro that's entirely in Mode 4, mostly to display these high quality static images, but it does actually make use of vertical offset per tile in addition to individual line scrolling to create this time warp effect right at the end. The title screen for Speed Racer also uses Mode 4 and actually also uses vertical offset per tile for the flag. Puzzle Bobble, also known as Bust a Move, is one of the rare cases, perhaps even the only case, where Mode 4 is used during gameplay. It requires the use of a high number of colours, so all combinations of the different coloured balls can be next to each other on the same tiles. It also takes advantage of the offset per tile functionality by using it to shift the playfield down periodically. Only the middle portion is Mode 4. It changes background mode on scanlines 32 and 166, and the top and bottom portions are Mode 1. This would be so they don't move down when the middle portion does, as remember, offset per tile affects entire columns. The balls are part of the background when they are stationary, but when they are actually moving, including when they fall after completing a matching set, they are sprites, so the usage here is really subtle. By the way, offset per tile, in any of the modes that support it, is the only way the Super Nintendo can do vertical split screens that independently scroll, like we see in the multiplayer mode of Puzzle Bobble. I actually found an example of this in action using horizontal offset per tile, albeit very brief. This is in Lethal Enforcers, with this animation that happens when you start the game in 2-player mode. The game switches into Mode 4 in order to specifically scroll the right hand side in at the same time as the left, and if we slow it down enough, we can see they are shifting by a tile's width at a time. It only happens once, and the whole animation only lasts for 15 frames, so it's a blink and you'll miss it moment, but it's there. You also won't see this in single player as it doesn't animate the right hand side. With offset per tile turned off, it definitely doesn't look right. There's a number of games that use Mode 4 in places, but don't make use of offset per tile, making the use of the mode rather peculiar. These include Rock and Roll Racing, specifically on this Buy Equipment screen, T2 the arcade game on the High Score screen, Mortal Kombat 2 on the Character Select screen, when displaying the character bios during the Attract mode, and for character endings, Secret of Evermore in its various menus, The Lost Vikings on its title screen, Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday on the map screen that appears between levels, Lemmings 2 on the title screen, Plock on the final end screen, and more. While pretty much all of these cases clearly benefit from the extra colours on background layer 1, none of them utilise offset per tile. The only theory I can postulate on this is that the content on background layer 2 only uses a few colours in each of these cases, so maybe they didn't think they needed the extra colours on that layer that Mode 3 would have provided, so went with Mode 4 instead. Mode 5 has two background layers, layer 1 at 4 bits per pixel, and layer 2 at 2 bits per pixel. The main draw of this mode is that it forces high resolution. It's the first of two modes that supports true H512. The horizontal resolution in this mode is doubled, from 256 by 224 to 512 by 224. When displayed on the TV, the image gets horizontally squashed, so the aspect ratio remains the same, but with double the number of horizontal pixels. Color maths is also not supported in this mode, so transparency effects are not possible. In mode 5, tiles can be 16 by 8 or 16 by 16. The former is so they appear the correct size when accounting for the squashing that happens. A 16 by 8 tile will appear as an 8 by 8 tile on the actual TV screen. We see mode 5 being utilised if we look at Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday again, though unlike that previous mode 4 example, it's more obvious why it was used. When you are about to enter a new level, there is a short screen with the name of the level on a detailed background. If we examine the tile map of these screens, we can clearly see it's twice the width and looks stretched out, but the final image in the game is squashed horizontally so it looks normal. There isn't much to these screens, they are very brief, but they are there. Most of the time this mode was used, however, it was for menus or other places that needed to display high resolution text. Secret of Mana is a well-known example of a game that uses mode 5 in its various menus, as does its Japanese-only sequel, Seiken Densetsu 3, which we now know in English as Trials of Mana. SD3 actually uses it for text boxes while playing too. The game usually runs in mode 1, but does temporary screen splits when text boxes appear to display mode 5 in just a portion of the screen with the text box, and mode 1 in the other portions. There's a few other mostly Japanese exclusive games that do something similar. For example, the RPG Dark Law Meaning of Death. This game uses mode 5 for its full screen menus, but in addition to that, during gameplay it actually permanently splits the screen to run in mode 1 in the top portion and mode 5 in the bottom portion, where the status information and various text boxes appear. Other games that use this mode exclusively for menus are Elite Soccer, ASP Airstrike Patrol, also known as Desert Fighter, and Smash Tennis. You might notice Smash Tennis also has interlacing enabled, so this is a good time to talk about that. Optionally, interlacing can be turned on in mode 5, which also doubles the vertical resolution from 512 by 224 to 512 by 448. Well, technically, interlacing can be turned on in any mode, and again was pretty rare to see in general, but when it was used, usually it was alongside mode 5 to specifically double the vertical resolution and the horizontal resolution at the same time, at the cost of halving the frame rate. This intro text in Cyvalian is another example. Notice how there's no stretching of the tile maps now. In interlaced mode, it basically draws half a scanline on one frame, then draws the other half on the next frame, technically drawing the second frame of scanlines half a scanline lower. In doing so, it effectively doubles the Super Nintendo's vertical resolution over 2 frames. The only known game that uses mode 5 to render the game world for actual gameplay, well, unless you count those screens in Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday as gameplay, is RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing. It's honestly a pretty bland isometric racer, but is the predecessor to the much better received Rock and Roll Racing. Basically, the entire game is using mode 5, including for all of the menus and even the title screen. Incidentally, it's also an example of screen interlacing being combined with mode 5, so the resolution is doubled in both directions, and if you look closely, you can probably notice it. It's also always doing a split screen and drawing the mode 5 tile map twice, even in single player mode. The mode's lack of colour is really apparent here. It looks really barren and boring, the tracks lack any detail to them, and the interlacing causes it to run at half the frame rate. Interestingly, the Japanese version was reworked. While the menus all still use mode 5, the game itself runs in mode 1, and the screen interlacing has been ditched too. The gameplay doesn't improve, and the controls are still pretty unresponsive, but at least it looks and runs much better. Mode 6 is the other true H512 forced high resolution mode. It has just one background layer at 4 bits per pixel, losing that second layer that mode 5 has in order to support offset per tile. Everything else about mode 6 is the same as mode 5, including not supporting color mattes. Like mode 5, mode 6 tiles can be 16 by 8 or 16 by 16. Now, at this point, pretty much everyone will say that unfortunately, no commercial game is known to ever run in Mode 6. I've said it myself in the past. And only Mode 5 was ever used. I don't believe any game actually ever used Mode 6. It appears to have gone completely unused during the console's lifespan, and has only been demonstrated in the years since in a few homebrew demos. But you know what? I wasn't ready to accept that as an answer. There were more than 1700 games released for the platform. Surely something had to use it. So I spent some time researching, and guess what? Something did. I actually found one officially released commercial game that uses Mode 6, and it's not even a particularly obscure game either. It's Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals, known simply as Lufia in PAL regions because we never got the first one. Specifically, it's used during the end credits roll. But don't just take my word for it, let's take a look with debug tools to confirm it. So as we can see, the very last scene is in Mode 7, then as that fades out and the credits start, the background mode changes to Mode 6. The very last scene is in Mode 7, then as that fades out and the credits start, the background mode changes to Mode 6. There it is! Mode 6 in action! On top of that, it's also got interlacing enabled, so it's running at the maximum 512 by 448 to display those names in the highest possible resolution. Now granted, this isn't particularly exciting, it's just scrolling white text on a black background, with no offset per tile in use either. I'm guessing that, similar to some of the uses of Mode 4 I mentioned, the developers chose to use Mode 6 instead of Mode 5 because they only needed one layer. But regardless, I can't tell you how psyched I was when I discovered this. How about that? There is actually a commercial game that uses Mode 6. I'm not 100% certain, but I think I might be the first person to confirm Mode 6 in an officially released game. Considering even Mode 5 was generally just used for mostly static screens or menus, it's understandable that developers probably never felt like they needed the offset per tile feature with a high resolution single layer image, hence why Mode 6 was basically never used. Finally, we have Mode 7. Mode 7 provides just one background layer, with each tile at 8 bits per pixel, giving it access to all 256 colours in CG RAM, and like Modes 3 and 4, also supports direct colour, so it doesn't necessarily need to use the colours in the palettes that are in memory. Mode 7 only uses 8x8 tiles, and Mode 7 tile maps are always 128 by 128 tiles in size, or 1024 by 1024 pixels. Only one Mode 7 tile map can be in memory at a time. Of course, this one background layer is unique, as it can be manipulated with affine transformations, and is perhaps the feature that the Super Nintendo is most famous for. It can take a tile map and perform a number of various mathematical transforms that affect how it appears on the screen. Firstly, it can scroll up, down, left and right, also referred to as translation, just like a tile map in any other mode, but this is where the similarities end. Unlike the tile maps in other modes, it can actually wrap around back to the other side when you reach the edge, which is demonstrated quite nicely in Demon's Crest here. Secondly, it can scale it larger or smaller, not just on both axes at once, but also only vertically or only horizontally. Thirdly, it can rotate it in either direction. Fourthly, it can apply shearing. And lastly, it can do both horizontal and vertical mirroring. It can also use any combination of these at once. Additionally, Mode 7 has a kind of sub-mode called EXTBG that creates a second layer as an exact copy of layer 1 except at 7 bits per pixel, so with half the number of colours, but it uses the 8th bit as a priority bit instead. This gives it the ability to specify pixels as high priority, allowing sprites to pass behind parts of the Mode 7 background which normally wouldn't be possible. This is how you can walk under the bridge in the second level in Contra 3. There's plenty of examples of Super Nintendo games that use Mode 7 in a variety of different ways. It was the second most commonly used mode after Mode 1. One game I want to highlight that makes a really cool use of Mode 7 is SOS, also known as Septentrion. The premise is that you're on board a sinking ship, and you need to find a way off it and rescue other passengers as you do so. It doesn't do anything too clever visually, but it uses Mode 7 to rotate the entire screen back and forth during the game to simulate the ship going under and breaking apart, which affects the physics and how you interact with the environment. It's a pretty novel way of designing the gameplay loop around the feature, and shows what could be done when thinking outside the box. This game is also using EXTBG actually. It's all a single Mode 7 layer, but the stairs are set to high priority, so the player character passes behind them. Mode 7 being more common didn't make direct color more common, but returning to Secret of Mana again, that game uses Mode 7 and direct color to draw the globe of the world that you can access while riding Flammy. ActRaiser 2 also uses Mode 7 and direct color to draw its world map. PGA Tour Golf is a rare example of a game that runs in Mode 7 with direct color for actual gameplay. A common misunderstanding is that Mode 7 can be used to apply affine transformations like scaling to sprites, but that's not the case. It can only apply them to a background. In the cases where you see a game doing so on something that looks like a sprite, like this example from Super Castlevania 4, that's actually a background, and the rest of the scene is often made up of sprites that are made to look like part of the scenery. Support for color maths is also limited in Mode 7. Due to it only having one unique layer, regardless of whether EXTBG is in use or not, it does not support it for backgrounds, but it does support it for sprites. The overworld of Final Fantasy VI is one example of this. The minimap in the bottom right of the screen is a sprite with transparency effects applied to it, and the glow on the horizon where the skyline meets the ground is actually also done using color maths applied to a big sprite. It can also still create windows and apply color maths effects inside those, like we see in Contra 3, or potentially blend the tile map with the backdrop color. Terranigma is the only game I can think of that does this though. If you want to see some more games that made really creative use of Mode 7, you should check out this video, where I study a number of examples and break down how each of them worked, including a full explanation of this effect in Terranigma. I also talk a bit more about how Mode 7 works, including EXTBG in that video, if you're interested in learning more about it in general. One thing Mode 7 can't do on its own, however, is the perspective effects that you often see associated with it, such as when it's being used for a racetrack or an overworld map. For that, it needs to be combined with HDMA, which is handy because that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. HDMA stands for H-blank Direct Memory Access, which provides the capability to interrupt the system in the tiny fraction of a second after one scanline finishes drawing, but before the next one starts, known as the horizontal blanking period or H-blank. In doing so, it can change what's being drawn to screen mid-frame. If you're a bit unclear on what exactly stuff like scanlines and blanking periods mean, I have a video that explains all of that, so check that out if you want some more information about this. The general idea of what HDMA does wasn't exclusive to the Super Nintendo. Other consoles from the time, like the Mega Drive and the TurboGrafx-16, could do similar kind of stuff by utilising their built-in scanline counters to fire off interrupts and alter what's being drawn mid-frame manually. These are often referred to as raster effects, as they are doing what's known as chasing the raster. But on the Super Nintendo, the ability to do this was a standard feature of the hardware. It provides specific registers for both DMA that happens during VBlank as well as HDMA, a one-time setup process, and a simple way of writing instructions, and many games take advantage of it in various ways to do all kinds of things. A really basic use of it, which has come up many times in my videos, is using it to effectively split the screen into two or more smaller segments to display different modes at the same time. For example, with maybe a Mode 1 sky at the top of the screen and a Mode 7 world or racetrack at the bottom of the screen. It does this by simply firing off an HDMA request to change the background mode mid-frame. Another application is using it to change the backdrop color, which is the color behind all the other layers that is visible if there's nothing else in front of it. This is normally a single color, but by using HDMA, this can be changed on a per scanline basis to create gradients, useful for stuff like sunsets for example. You can even make animations with it by changing the colors on each scanline every frame. And some games, like Game Bear Goemon 3, do exactly this to effectively make an extra background, particularly if Mode 7 is in use. HDMA can also be used to easily create warping effects, like we see in the underwater levels in many games like Donkey Kong Country, by slightly offsetting the horizontal and vertical scroll registers on different scan lines every frame, usually using what's called indirect HDMA that utilizes pointers to the HDMA data rather than the data table itself. We can see a combination of HDMA tricks going on in the background of the first level of Super Turrican 2. The warping of the image to make the heat haze is all HDMA, and it's also being used to gradually change the backdrop color to create the gradient in the sky. It can also be used to create circular or cylindrical effects. The famous spinning room in Super Castlevania 4 is combining Mode 7 with HDMA. Specifically, HDMA is used to horizontally scale the lines towards the top and bottom a bit larger and add a darker gradient in the middle. This creates the illusion that you are walking through a spinning tunnel. This rolling effect seen in Axlay's vertically scrolling levels is another good example, and this one in particular is often confused for Mode 7, but it's not. This is all HDMA, skipping the rendering of scan lines near the top, but actually duplicating them towards the bottom, and there's clearly multiple independently scrolling layers. This late game level in Super Turrican 2 does the same thing. Like Axlay, it's running in Mode 1. The title screens in games like Cyvalian and Ghoul Patrol perform a similar trick, all done with HDMA. It can even be used hand in hand with some clever artwork to make some 3D looking effects. These beams in the background of some levels in Donkey Kong Country 2, for example, are a clever parallax scrolling effect utilizing HDMA. Even these falling walls in Yoshi's Island, believe it or not, are done entirely using HDMA. Even though they look like they're made of 3D polygons, the Super FX2 chip isn't involved in the creation of this particular trick at all, though it is being used for some other effects that are happening at the same time, like this rotation. And of course, one of the more common applications of HDMA was to modify how a Mode 7 tile map was displayed, most commonly to shift to a perspective for something like an overworld map or racetrack. This was so common that you'd be forgiven for thinking this must have just been a standard capability of Mode 7, but it actually couldn't do this on its own. The world map while riding Flammy in Secret of Mana is as good a place as any to use as an example of this. Firstly, HDMA is used to change background modes mid-frame, initially on exactly scanline 100. The top portion is in Mode 1, the bottom portion is in Mode 7. HDMA is then used to perform Mode 7 scaling on a per scanline basis, rather than the whole screen at once, on every scanline from 101 to the bottom of the screen. It alters the scaling percentage and makes it just a little bit bigger on each line. In this game, the scanline where the mode swap happens actually moves too, as you fly higher or lower, with the range being between scanline 80 and 103 inclusive. And this perspective effect adjusts whenever the player does that. When the player turns, a Mode 7 rotation calculation is done on every scanline, rotating each one a little bit less as it moves down the screen. And if you think I'm exaggerating when I say it's constantly performing these matrix calculations on every single scanline, I'm not. Using debug tools, we can see all of the Mode 7 register hits that are continuously happening every frame, from the scanline where the split happens, all the way down to scanline 224, which is the last visible line. It really is incredible when you think about just how many complex calculations are going on in the background in order to achieve this. When you go low enough that the camera shifts into an overhead view, all of the HDMA calls are turned off, because from this camera position, there's no extra manipulation of the Mode 7 tile map going on. I didn't examine other advanced capabilities of the Super Nintendo this time around, such as color maths, transparency effects, pseudo high resolution and windows, as I've already covered those subjects extensively in the past in this video. Something I haven't covered much though is the mosaic function. While other consoles were capable of doing this in software, the Super Nintendo had it built into the hardware, allowing developers to easily create the effect by enabling a specific register. It was available to use in all 8 background modes and could be selectively turned on or off on any background layer, though sprites were unaffected. Once enabled, it provided 16 different levels of pixelation that could be cycled through by setting the size of the blocks. Most of the time, it was used as a transition effect. Super Mario World, a launch game for the console, uses it when entering levels. The Chess Master uses it when the title screen appears and disappears. Many RPGs, like Final Fantasy VI, use it for battle transitions. In fact, Final Fantasy VI uses it in a number of other cases too, for example as you are walking around if one of your party is poisoned. Super Castlevania 4 uses it a bit differently and pretty subtly during the final battle with Dracula when he gets hit. Going back to Slave Beast Tarka in Contra 3, his body blows with a mosaic effect every few frames. Chrono Trigger also uses it as part of this effect after the first encounter with Magus, in combination with a number of other techniques. To get the full explanation on this one though, as well as many other effects, you'll need to watch my video dedicated to that game. Now that I've mentioned it, you'll probably notice this effect in many games now, like Super Punch-Out, that you might not have noticed before. Springy Majig left a question asking about the level Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy in Yoshi's Island, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this effect, and it's a good one to study here as it combines a few different techniques that we've looked at. When you touch these fuzzy guys, the screen starts warping around really strangely as if Yoshi was drunk. Vertical offset per tile in Mode 2 is utilised here as part of the effect. Specifically, it's making the foreground terrain Yoshi walks on shift up and down. The background manipulation you see going on at the same time is done with a combination of individual line scrolling, warping with HDMA in a very similar way to how Axlay does it, and some scaling courtesy of the Super FX2 chip. Yeah, in this particular case, the Super FX2 chip is helping out to achieve this final result. So here's all of the background modes again, organised into one table. Every background mode supported HDMA, window masks, mosaic, and interlacing, in addition to their unique features. Modes 0 through to 4 all supported background and sprite transparency effects through color maths and pseudo high resolution. Modes 5 and 6 did not support transparency at all, and Mode 7 only supported it with sprites. And that's it, a pretty extensive explanation of all the Super Nintendo's background modes as well as HDMA and how it's used in conjunction with them. This one took a lot of work to put together. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.